in May of 1961. However, when those state leaders literally ran away, our state constitution required a convention to replace those state office holders who had abandoned their positions. I agreed to accept the office of provisional governor as elected by those delegates that you, the people, chose to represent you as part of that constitutional convention of 1861. My role was intended to be temporary, but here we are, 2.5 years later, in 1863. It is my desire to end this war. However, we cannot use violence and civil unrest to accomplish what we want. I am aware that some of you, and even in this audience, want to take extreme measures to end this war. My position has always been that it is the Constitution which is the guiding principle on what we do. We cannot permit the passions, the emotions of the day to dictate what we as a government, what we as a people do. I have fought to prevent a military takeover of our state government. I opposed General Fremont in his efforts to become a military governor. I opposed his proclamation to free the slaves as not the correct time for such a drastic change. We still have a constitution, and the military cannot arbitrarily arrest our citizens, even the free Black person. I first want our civil and our criminal courts to be fully functional. Our citizens deserve to be judged under civil law and not by martial law. If I may be permitted to go back in time, when I was a judge on the Missouri Supreme Court some 10 years ago, I was called upon with other judges of the Supreme Court to determine whether a gentleman of African descent should be declared a free man and no longer a slave as he had been treated. I wrote the dissenting opinion in which I ruled that the Black gentleman named Dred Scott should be and was indeed a free person. That is, when Mr. Dred Scott was living in the state of Illinois and in the territory of Wisconsin, he became a free man under the laws of those jurisdictions. Missouri was required to respect that status of freedom. Now, while my fellow judges on the Supreme Court overruled me, I strongly disagreed. Now, if I may be permitted to share with you a part of my written dissenting opinion, I would like to share that with you. I wrote, "We cannot deviate from the text of the law and precedents established by the court. In spite of temporary public excitements, it is proper that the judicial mind, calm and self-balanced, should adhere to principles established when there was no feeling to disturb the view of the legal question upon which the rights of the parties depend. These cases here referred to are cases decided when the public mind was tranquil, and when the tribunals maintained in their decisions the principles which had always received the approbation of an enlightened public opinion. Times may have changed, public feeling may have changed, but principles have not and do not change, and in my judgment, there can be no safe basis for judicial decisions but in those principles which are immutable. I hold it my duty to declare that the voluntary removal of a slave by his master to a state, territory, or country in which slavery is prohibited with a view to reside there entitles that slave to his freedom. And that right may be asserted by action in our courts under our laws. As your governor, I still believe in those principles of the rule of law. However, we are a divided state, a divided country. And long festering is this issue of slavery, which has been foisted upon us. Although I was born and educated in the state of Virginia, I have made this great state of Missouri my home, my life's work. I am familiar with its history. How the territory of Missouri was once under the rule of the countries of France and Spain prior to the Louisiana Purchase. That the laws of slavery were different from what the American settlers understood when they immigrated from the east to the frontiers of Missouri, bringing their slaves with them. Then when the territory of Missouri in 1820 applied to become a state, it did create such a fire alarm in the federal Congress that a compromise had to be imposed, allowing Missouri to enter as a slave state, with the state of Maine at the same time entering our union as a free state. Furthermore, this compromise did set a boundary line between North and South where slavery might or might not be permitted. I'm also aware that Congress allowed its passions to change the law in 1850 with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, permitting the new territories to decide the issue of slavery by popular vote. Now, this new law allowed strangers to flood into Kansas to vote on the issue of slavery. The consequences were fights at the border between Missouri and Kansas, with bushwhackers and abolitionists retaliating against each other, responding to death and destruction with more death and destruction. Then our federal Supreme Court has taken upon itself to rule that the gentleman from Missouri, named Dred Scott, is not even a citizen worthy of any rights to be recognized by the white man. All this history has been brought to you here in Boone County. Your men and your families are in this fight, and I am aware of the brave men that have fought gallantly upon our battlefields of this war. I know some of the families here: F.J. Russell, Mordecai Oliver, Holden Guitar, and many others. We want to honor their lives, and hopefully in the far off future, the community here will continue to honor those who have served our country. But today, as we said here in November of 1863, Missouri and its citizens are indeed at a critical and strategic part of a successful war effort. We have the great waterways of the Missouri and the Mississippi rivers to offer transportation. We have valuable iron, lead, and hemp, and our crops to support the troops. But we have our internal fights as well. We have many citizens that are still sympathetic to the Southern Confederate cause, and the forceful imposition of violence from our own federal troops occupying our state has the consequence of convincing many of our citizens to side with the South in order to assert the rights of states to govern their own local affairs rather than by federal occupation. However, on the other extreme, we have the radical Republicans who want immediate emancipation of the slaves, and additionally, harsh retaliatory measures taken against any citizen that sided with the South. I know many of my citizens here in Boone County are reading the German newspapers from St. Louis. I, as governor, received many criticisms for not taking their desired extreme positions. I've been labeled a traitor, a secret secessionist. Even if you here in the audience favor what is written in the German newspapers, I want to assure you that we must mediate a compromise so as to end this bloodshed. But it will take time and patience for all. Any extreme position on either side will only create more chaos and destruction. As your leader, I cannot tolerate any further damage. I've met with our president, Mr. Lincoln, and I continue to be in communication with him. I will be asking President Lincoln to assure us Missourians that we can have hope that this war will be ending soon, and that his federal troops will show more discipline in the treatment of our citizens. I did indeed write a letter to the president over 2 years ago expressing my concerns about a military takeover. I would like to read that letter to you out loud so that you, the people, can learn whether or not we have the support of our president. My letter to the President of the United States, the White House, Washington, D.C., dated August 26th, 1861. Dear Mr. President, the actions of the federal troops in Missouri have done much to embarrass and cripple me in my attempts to restore peace and fidelity to the Union throughout our state of Missouri. In fact, I have very little hope that peace can be restored while the friends of the Constitution are unable to defend the actions of the military officers of the federal government. Now, I am not ignorant of the fact that in all wars, there are violations of private rights. But it is seldom in modern times that such abuses have the express sanction of officers in high command. I leave this subject to your consideration, merely remarking that I am continually embarrassed by the complaints of real Union men against the action of the military, whose conduct I can neither excuse nor control. While I have become hardened against complaints of the secessionists, I still have a deep interest in the protection of real Union men. If it were possible to subject the military in acting upon unarmed citizens to any control of a civil officer or a body of civilians, much of the cause of present complaint would be removed. I think our president heard what I was saying. Unfortunately, the federal military personnel are still violating some of our rights here in Missouri. But I think it is clear that our communities here in Boone County have suffered enough loss. But the fact is, our Union armies are starting to turn the tide in this war. We had a victory earlier this summer in Vicksburg. Further east in Pennsylvania, the battle at Gettysburg has given the Union hope that the Southern armies are not able to invade the North. So I hope that in spite of your past sufferings, we as a people together can have hope for a lasting peace and union with our Southern family. It may take more time. I invite your patience in place of violence and retaliation. Now, as your governor, I would like to hear from you, the people. But first, I understand we have some journalists in the audience. And so if I may call upon our journalist. Are there any journalists in the audience?
Mr. Governor, Mr. Governor, I have a question.
Yes, the gentleman from the Booneville Patriot, please.
Yes, sir. Governor Gamble, sir, before you took office, you had given your assurances that the United States Constitution would be followed. That is, property in the form of slaves would be returned to their owners as required by Article 4, Section 2 of the Constitution. Now, a population of Black persons occupy our state without being subject to arrest. What do you say about your constitutional promises now?
Well, sir, I have always taken the position that the Constitution is indeed our guiding principle. I will follow the Constitution, but the truth of the matter is that during times of war, we do need balance. Certain civil liberties, certain freedoms are limited to preserve lives. That's what war is about. I realize that the war will infringe upon certain civil liberties, including interference with the ownership of personal private property. But what do we prefer? Some inconveniences at the time or loss of life? Now, for the gentleman from Booneville, I do recall that when, before he became general, U.S. Grant was in Jefferson City in August of 1861. Now, under his command, he actually had the editor of your newspaper, Booneville Patriot, arrested for giving comfort to the enemy and inciting resistance to the laws of the United States. I disagreed with that action, and I continue to fight for constitutional principles. However, any necessity for military action has to be just that. A necessity temporarily imposed because of a war measure, not as a political or emotional reaction. Now, earlier this year, President Lincoln did institute a well thought out plan to emancipate the slaves from the southern states in rebellion. This was a means to effectively reduce the power of the South in using slaves in support of their war efforts. Your question about the constitutional requirement to deliver the runaway slave should have occurred during the time of war, but it's a difficult situation. On a temporary basis, the military law is a necessity in the prosecution of war. However, I will not honor a military takeover of our government. And I agree with you that this issue of slavery has to be addressed. But no one extreme position will be favored. Thank you, sir. Any other journalists in the audience?
Mr. Governor, yes, please. I have another question, sir.
Well, let me call on the St. Louis Observer. Is there a gentleman from the St. Louis Observer?
Right here, sir. Mr. Governor, you were very critical of General Fremont during his leadership in this war. It's been said that if the policies of General Fremont remained in place, like martial law and emancipation of the black man, Missouri would not be suffering through this war as it has during the past 2 years. Do you regret your recommendation to President Lincoln that caused General Fremont to be removed from the state of Missouri?
No, not at all. I generally prefer that the military professionals conduct themselves in military matters and not impose themselves in civil matters or involve themselves with local politics. General Fremont did not work well with others. He clearly made it known that he was not willing to play by the rules. For whatever reason, he thought of himself as aristocracy. General Fremont was lavish and extravagant with expenses. He even had fancy dressed Hungarians as his security guards. However, the more serious complaints are that Fremont failed to engage in battle with General Sterling Price, losing the battles at Wilson Creek and at Lexington. Mr. Fremont hired his own friends for the fortifications in St. Louis at profits. The reports are now coming in at 4 times the budget. Then Fremont's own declaration of emancipating the slaves near the beginning of this war caused a great loss of loyalty to the federal government and made my job so much more difficult to recruit state militia and to keep Missouri in the Union. No, it is my position that Fremont, if he were left in command, Missouri would actually be worse off. It's the people. If the people would tolerate what he done, I would be fearful that others would react with more destruction and more conflict. More bad acts would definitely have occurred under Fremont's dictatorship. President Lincoln was a wise man to relieve Fremont of his command. Well, I think we got time for another question. Is the gentleman from Monitor Vauxhall?
Governor, we, the German community, have been the strongest supporters of you. We have been the best trained soldiers. Why do you not free the black people from slavery?
Again, a difficult question. I appreciate your question. I have expressed my agreement with our President Lincoln about a policy of gradual emancipation and the correct use of military law occurred in the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation at the beginning of this year. In Missouri, we do have 2 extremes, and it's difficult to reconcile all issues. On one side, we have the radical Republicans who want immediate emancipation and harsh retaliatory actions against the South. Now, the other side, those who defend slavery as a positive good, beneficial to slave and slaveholder alike, and argue that the Constitution protects their rights, even to take this country to war. I do not agree with either extreme. In order to maintain law and order in this state, I will not interfere with the institution of slavery, but rather through legislation, I advocate for the gradual eradication of slavery. That is our worthwhile goal. A gradual, compensated emancipation plan to end slavery in this state. That is the only way I see to end this bloodshed. The interest of the master is to be considered as well as the interest of the slave. I have a legislative plan that I have proposed, a plan of transition to end slavery. The content of that legislation includes 4 items here. Number 1, the sale of slaves shall cease in the state of Missouri on the 4th day of July, 1870. Secondly, any slave over the age of 40 on that 4th day of July, 1870, shall remain a servant with his master for life. Third, those persons of the Negro race under the age of 12 shall remain servants until they reach the age of 23 years. Fourthly, all others of the Negro race shall be released from servitude on that 4th day of July, 1870. Now, I respect the radical Republicans and the German newspapers in their rights of freedom of speech and freedom of the press. I will not abridge those constitutional rights. But I have to repeat myself, I do not favor extreme positions. Rather, I seek your support for this legislation as the best alternative to continuing our fight. I see we have others.
Mr. Governor, over here, will you please allow the St. Joseph Journal to ask a question?
Yes, the gentleman from St. Joseph, please.
Mr. Governor, you profess your support for a government by civilians, but surely you are aware of the military action on Missouri's western border. Earlier this summer, General Ewing took the drastic action of confiscation of all property located in certain counties bordering Kansas, burning down all buildings, destroying all crops, and forcing relocation, making our Missouri citizens to become refugees without any home or property. What say you in response to this travesty?
Well, a very important question, especially this year. First, let me take responsibility for being out of the state of Missouri this summer. I had to travel to Pennsylvania with my sick wife for some medical care that she needed drastically. However, our state was in the good hands of our Lieutenant Governor, Willard Hall. Now, I do not believe that General Thomas Ewing and his commanding officer, General Schofield, were attempting any nefarious action behind my back, but rather I think the circumstances did dictate a response. Recall that earlier in August, right before General Order Number 11 came out, Quantrell and his murderous gang had ransacked Lawrence, Kansas. The Kansas people were planning to retaliate. In fact, there's evidence that Senator Lane had raised his own private army to invade Missouri. And obviously the intent probably would have been to plunder and murder, much like Quantrell did, against our own Missouri citizens. So the real question about Order Number 11 is, was it fully warranted as a military situation called for? Was it necessary? Or was it unjustified as a deed of military tyranny? Now, I'm aware that Thomas Ewing is a Kansas Republican, likely seeking favor with Senator Lane for his own political ambitions. But the evidence also shows that many of our citizens in the western counties of Missouri were aiding and protecting the Confederate guerrillas, the bushwhackers. Military law does permit actions against civilians who aid and protect the enemy. Now, however, to punish the innocent citizen along with the bad actors does raise concern. And as well as the Union soldiers that were executing General Order Number 11. Many of those soldiers are guilty of plunder just as well as anybody else. I don't know what kind of restitution will be offered. I am receiving some reports that many of the landowners are being able to go back and rebuild their homes. But I tell you, I will be an advocate to the loyal Missouri citizens in receiving just compensation for their loss, as our Constitution does require. Thank you for that question. Okay, any other journalists? I think a gentleman from the Columbia, Missouri Statesman is here. Yes.
Governor, as a lawyer, you've had a reputation as a winning advocate for your clients. Many young men in our town of Columbia have spoken of an interest to study the law. May we invite you to share some of your favorite cases from the courtroom?
Oh, well, thank you for that question. I want to encourage your young men to consider the practice of law. It's an honorable profession and but demanding. So they need to work hard to be the best lawyer that they can. So for me, well, there's two types of cases I have found very interesting during my career as a lawyer. Those cases that dealt with slave freedom lawsuits and cases that dealt with land title disputes. Both these types of cases were very complicated, seem to have many different fact issues and different laws that would apply. So no one case was similar to another case. You always had to do your research for each individual case. As for the freedom lawsuits, all states, even the states in the southern part of our country, have statutory procedures that would enable a Black person to assert his or her freedom. Now, of course, that has changed recently by the federal court's Dred Scott versus Sanford case, but I have had much experience in assisting clients in asserting their freedom. But you have to appreciate such a heroic act of the individual slave to sue his own master. Many times, the owners would ship their slaves away if there was a lawsuit filed. A lot of times, the slave would suffer physical violence, lots of beatings for having filed the lawsuit. So as an attorney, we always had to ask the court for orders to preclude removing the slave from the state and even having a bond. So the slave owner had to post a bond to guarantee that the slave could participate in the court system. Now, these freedom lawsuits did vary as to a basis for freedom. The questions came up such as, was a particular individual born in a free state? And that would make the person free at all times. If the slave was a slave but spent some time in a free state, did that time make the slave a free person? Sometimes the issue would be determinative upon whether the slave was just passing through the state. Was there an intent to remain in the state as a citizen? And some issues even required a discussion as to the purpose of the trip and whether or not the trip was interrupted by, there was one case where the wagon wheel fell off and they ended up staying in the state for 2 weeks. But does it take 2 weeks to fix your wagon wheel? That was always an issue. As well, we had some military personnel who would take their slaves with them on assignment when they were transferred to a particular military post in a free state. And the argument was that they didn't necessarily need to take their slave with them. They claimed that they had to take their slaves with them as part of the military orders, but there was nothing written in the military order to take your slave with you. So we were able to free some individuals, even though they were their masters were military personnel. Other issues did a prior owner actually free the slave? Was there a written certificate of manumission? You could actually give freedom to your own slave, usually by a written certificate. The question was that certificate authentic? Were there forgeries? And another means for the master to relieve his slave of bondage was through a last will and testament. When they would die, they would declare freedom for their slaves. That created a lot of family fights. Some parts of the family, some siblings wanted freedom, some siblings asserted a right to the property of the decedent, alleging undue influence or forged wills. So there were all kinds of family dynamics in some of those cases. Sometimes the slave was able to purchase their own freedom. The master, unfortunately, would not give a receipt, kept the money, and wanted to keep the slave. We had fights like that. So one particular case was very interesting. One of the first in Missouri in 1824, we had our statute with regard to freedom lawsuits. And Missouri had a unique provision that allowed the court to appoint a lawyer to represent the slave. And I actually got appointed by the court to represent a slave that had Native American Indian descent, ancestry. And what happened before Missouri became Missouri, it was part of Spain. The Spanish governor declared the fact that no Indian could be a slave. The idea for the Spanish governor was to have good relations with the native tribes, of course. And so he declared no slavery allowed for the Indians, against the Indians. So we were able to prove the pedigree of this individual slave and gain her freedom. But this was against a wealthy family in St. Louis, the Shoto family, and the court, this case kind of drug along, fighting their arguments all along the way. So the other cases that I find favor with are the land title cases. And again, before Missouri became Missouri, the countries of Spain and France owned this territory. And a lot of times their government officials would declare titles, would have land grants. A lot of times there were no writings. The writings were either lost and not recorded. Surveys were not conducted or inadequate surveys. Also, there were squatters involved. Now, as part of the Louisiana Purchase, our government agreed to honor the existing land grants. However, the United States also took an opportunity to make some revenue with the land that we had in Missouri and granted its own titles to encourage settlers to come west. And the federal government also offered bounties or patents to military veterans of the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. So we had a lot of land ownership overlap. And then in 1811 was the earthquake in the southeast part of the state. A lot of destruction from that earthquake. And as a relief measure, the federal government offered land grants to move people away from their destroyed property. Again, another layer of ownership to make it more complicated. So with all these conflicting claims, a lot of speculators also made claims and joined in the fight over title ownership. So Congress set up a land commission to determine and adjudicate land titles. So that required a lot of documents, a lot of testimony, depositions. You had to hire a lawyer. Unfortunately, a lot of sad cases where your ancestor or your own family would lose title, even though you cleared the land and built on the land. There's a lot of sad cases. And unfortunately, the only people to win in those cases were the lawyers with their fees. So those two type of cases were kind of my favorite. And so with that, any other journalists or any other individuals that have questions or concerns, please state your concerns. You need to tell me how to do my job, if you wish. If there are no questions, I can take off. Oh, yes, looks like a question.
I have a question for Mr. Stephen Stark.
Well, let me take off my hat and pretend I'm Stephen Stark.
Okay. In the US election of 1860, there were 4 candidates for president.
Correct.
I believe they were in no particular order, Abraham Lincoln, Stephen Douglas, John Breckinridge, and John Bell.
Well, yeah,
Those- I
yeah,
guess those are-
yeah.
We can tell from, based on your presentation, that Governor Gamble in 1863 was a supporter of Abraham Lincoln. Based on your research into Gamble's life and politics, which of these four candidates do you think Mr. Gamble would have supported at the time of the 1860 rather than 1863 election, and why?
Okay, as I understand it, Douglas won the statewide. Let's see, Bell from Tennessee, is that right? Tennessee, I think he came in second, Breckinridge third, and then Lincoln fourth, statewide. St. Louis, where the German immigrants were really strong Republicans. I think St. Louis gave Lincoln the majority of the votes. Gamble was a Whig in his early years. Actually, I don't know. I don't have his voting record, so I can't tell you for sure. But I don't think he knew the Republican Party well enough to vote for Lincoln. I kind of doubt that he would have voted for Lincoln. So he was, from Virginia, Southern, but and I think Bell was neutral enough with regard to the slavery issue, even though he's from Tennessee. He supported the Union. So I think that Bell from Tennessee probably would have gained his vote, but Lincoln would have been close second probably, because he would not have favored Douglas, would not have favored Breckinridge for sure. Yes.
Did Gamble serve in the state legislature before the Civil War?
Yes, he was in there for 2 years. He was actually the prosecuting attorney in New Franklin, Howard County. And then I think they elected him for 2 years, and then a new administration came in, and he became like the Secretary of State for, I think it was Frederick Bates was the governor in the 1830s, maybe. So he was involved in state government politics quite a bit, but then he decided to go back after the next governor didn't. Let's see what happened. There was something that happened, either a new governor or, well, I don't think he liked Jefferson City, so I didn't want to. When they moved the capital to Jefferson City in 1826, I think that kind of gave him an enticement to move back to St. Louis. But the state capital was in St. Charles, so he was working out of St. Charles after he was working in Howard County. Then the lawyers in St. Louis got together and nominated him to run for Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was an elected position, so I don't think he wanted to necessarily get back involved in state government, but the other attorneys strongly encouraged him. And he did resign after 2.5 years from the Supreme Court. His health was not all that good, and apparently he could make more money fighting the land titles. So he went back to St. Louis and practiced law.
Did he go to the University of Virginia Law School?
No, he went to a college called Hampton Sydney in Virginia, but he didn't actually go to a law school. He just studied the law. Back then, they typically did it like an apprentice. You just sat in the office with another lawyer.
Tell us how it ended because we had 2 governors and they both died in office.
Right. Well, Gamble actually, he died like January 30th, maybe January 31st of 1864. So he, 2 things happened to him. He injured his arm real badly, and I guess it kind of caused an infection. Then he slipped and fell at the mansion in Jefferson City, and didn't break any bones, but apparently caught pneumonia as a result of, I guess, low immunity. I don't know. Back then, I guess pneumonia was a common thing. So he, I guess, technically died of pneumonia in January of '64. And I'm not sure how Jackson died. He died in '62, I guess, in Texas, I think. But yeah, apparently they had huge funeral for him in St. Louis for Gamble. And he's buried at the Bellefontaine Cemetery in North St. Louis.
Fox Jackson, died in Arkansas.
Arkansas? Okay, yeah, he was out of state, I think. Yeah, you're right.
Governor Gamble was basically appointed because they would not allow them to actually have another presidential type election after Jackson had disappeared or
Yeah,
he was run out of Jeff City or whatever happened to him.
yeah, there was, well, actually, I guess the Battle of Boonville was June of 61, but yeah, so there was no, and the lieutenant governor and I think the secretary, the treasury took off with the seal. So there was no government officials. And by the delegates to this convention, actually, the convention had been called by Jackson to determine the question of whether or not to stay in the Union. So there was a convention set up to determine the relationship with the federal government. And the majority of the people in Missouri, or the delegates of Missouri, said, well, we can't really, economically speaking, we don't want to leave the Union. And of course, Missouri was a slave state, but didn't have the big plantations. So they decided to kind of remain for the Union rather than join the South. I think Jackson believed that he needed to do it militarily. He needed to create a insurrection here in the state of Missouri. So I think they had a kind of a negotiation that broke down pretty severely, and he just walked out. But since the convention had been called and they already had their elected delegates, the delegates after the state of
Government was gone.
government was gone, yeah. After the leaders left, they decided to put provisional ones in, but they did call for election at the end of the year, and I guess
It's generally now never had the popular vote, if I remember right.
well, I don't, yeah, maybe, or there was just too much chaos to conduct an election. I mean, the war was going on and the bushwhackers and the Union soldiers were all fighting. So I think they just said we can't really have a honest election if everybody's fighting and probably shooting each other at the voting hole, I'm sure. But so yeah, it kept getting extended. I think they were supposed to have elections in November of 61, and then I think they were going to try to do it in August of 62, but they never. Yeah, you're right. Never got around to it.
The Dred Scott thing, that was a military type thing that you were mentioning, wasn't it?
Well, the Emancipation Proclamation. Dred Scott was decided before the Civil War. And
I thought it was owned by a military.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, Emerson was a military doctor, physician, and he got sent to Illinois
Illinois, but at that time, Illinois, you would not take any sort of a colored person, free or slave.
Okay, well, but it was part of the Northwest Territory, and therefore it was supposed to be a free state. So the ruling was that if a black person comes into a free state, if slavery was attempted to be introduced into a free state, that would make the slave a free person. So there would be no slavery.
I was raised in a small town in Illinois that had the slave underground or whatever it was called. And they actually a house across where we lived. And from what I understood was that they would have the Underground Railroad bring them up through Cairo. And this was at Oswego, Illinois. Which is 40 miles west of Chicago. And my understanding was that they couldn't keep them in Illinois, that they had to continue. And I thought, went to Canada.
Well, yeah, Canada would be freer because in the Constitution, there's still the Fugitive Act, where all states have to honor the Constitution that says if you have a slave that can be arrested, you need to return him back to the owner.
Yeah, he went from Illinois out Montana or someplace after that.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
I do not. I was gonna see if the online people had any questions.
Yeah.
Anybody online have a question for Governor Gamble? Or Stephen Stark, who's also here with us.
Hey, State, can you hear me?
Hear you good, David.
Check your email. I sent you an email while this was going on. Can you do that?
I can. I thought. Yeah, I'll work on that for next time, Dave. I can't do
Okay,
anything.
because it,
I'm not a lighting tech. We're lucky
Oh.
you even had it.
Too dark.
Yeah, it's too dark. Sorry about that.
that's okay. I just,
I have a question about governors and the state troops that they're supposed to have control of, like the state militia, the enrolled Missouri militia, et cetera. How much control did Gamble have over these troops and the following governor?
Right. Well, good question. There, of course, the Missouri militia, no, let's see. I get this kind of confused. There's a home guard and then there's the
hey, that's good, Stacy.
The lights better sitting down.
Oh, okay. The Missouri State Militia was the Confederates. They were,
State Guard.
yeah. And then the Home Guard was something that was created by Gamble or by the provisional government to recruit locals to be militia, basically. But then I think because of the arrangement with the federal government, they became under the command of the federal generals.
The Missouri State Militia, Union, Missouri State Guard was.
Is that the way? Okay, okay.
The
So
guard went away when,
Jackson left.
when they became Confederates, when they joined Price. Price was commander of the State Guard, and when he joined the Confederates, the State Guard was dissolved.
Okay.
And the Missouri State Militia was created under Gamble for, Missouri would provide the troops and the federal government would provide the uniforms
Right, okay.
and equipment.
And I think also locally, maybe at the county level or municipal
That's
level,
the enrolled militia.
yeah, they had, that wasn't necessarily federalized. Are they?
No, sometimes.
Sometimes, okay.
But the reason I ask
Yeah.
is I've read quite a few ORs, especially during Price's reign,
Uh-huh.
that never mention governor's involvement that I recall
Oh.
seeing
Yeah.
with these troops. That's one heck of a lot of state troops, militia, home guard, involved in a lot of this activity. So I'm really curious, did the
Oh.
governor have anything to say at that time? Or it couldn't have been Gamble during Price's reign, it was some.
Yeah.
I think in organizing the Missouri State Militia, Gamble had contacted the president. And they kind of made the offer, I think Gamble made the offer to, because first of all, Missouri State volunteer troops were being sent in with Grant into Western Theater. And so Gamble wanted troops to stay in Missouri and fight the guerrillas. And so he made the offer to Lincoln, is this, we will supply the troops, if you supply the equipment, but they have to stay in Missouri.
Yeah.
And so they said, okay, fine.
They got repeating rifles. They got repeating rifles that way, right?
Yep.
Okay, any other questions? Stephen, it's been a good.
Cut recording.
Yeah, we're gonna say goodbye to our folks out there.
No, the folks can stay. I'm just gonna cut the recording, right?
Okay, do that. All of this